Greetings, everyone. My name's Ed Keller. I'm the director of the Center for Transformative Media at the New School and faculty in the School of Design Strategies there. I'm delighted to be able to offer some comments on and around Peter's work. His work has been a crucial influence for me for 7 or 8 years or more at this point. And I've been honored and delighted to be able to have a number of conversations with him and have him join conferences that we've held in New York City. Also, he's been incredibly generous in joining some of the seminars, the Post Planetary design seminars that I teach at Parsons, and I've taught there for about 7 years now. His work has been a big influence on those seminars and the genesis of those seminars, indeed. So today I want to talk both directly and indirectly to Peter's work and cover some of the territory that I'm working on myself that his writing, especially Blindsight and Echopraxia, have informed. Looking at a question of what constitutes a planetary timescape and how one could imagine cosmopolitics by extrapolating as above, so below from the planetary up to the cosmological and back. What is the situation we find ourselves in? I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away." So this, in a way, is the situation, and Shelley's poem and Tansi's quite brilliant Triumph Over Mastery painting, I think, set the question for us in terms of self-consciousness and reflection. Recursiveness. What does it mean to be recursively conscious, to be sapient? Is it possible for a planetary framework to provide that platform? This is, I think, what Peter's work questions, challenges, and investigates. Let's think about the planetary. On planets, there is an indexical nature in the landscape, material, temporal. It declares the very specific nature of how material systems bundle together different temporalities. Every planet, our Earth, has a register of massive addressability of communication, information, and indexical information flow in the river system itself and the meanders of the river system. Our human attempts to control those flows in infrastructure provide us a set of dissonant paradigms of contact with these layers of temporality. We try to control this flow by halting or filtering it. And across history, we've been aware of this set of temporalities in different ways. Let's consider Ruskin's comments in his writing, The Stones of Venice. His idea was that Venice, the city itself, was an index of the mixing of flows of cool cultures of the north and hot cultures of South Europe and North Africa. He uses geological metaphors like glaciers and lava to discuss this. Quote from Ruskin, "The glacier stream of the Lombards and the following one of the Normans left their erratic blocks wherever they had flowed, but without influencing, I think, the southern nations beyond the sphere of their own presence. But the lava stream of the Arab, even after it ceased to flow, warmed the whole of the northern air, and the history of Gothic architecture is the history of the refinement and spiritualization of northern work under its influence." So we see here the idea that cultural flows, architectural styles, the geomorphology and the billions of years of history that are writ in the stone itself of Venice are all in some kind of contact with each other. There's a geomorphological forensics, which Ruskin is carrying on here, that links the life lived billions of years ago with the shimmering horizons of thought being formed. And this is a composition between present human biology, the current bacterial, the ancient geomorphological. In Resonance, let's consider The Great Flood, a film by Bill Morrison, scored by the guitarist Bill Frisell, which meditates on the 1927 Mississippi flood and the consequent diaspora from the American South to Chicago and Detroit, which leads to a condensation of musical flows and guitar styles, a geological event which precipitates a kind of international tide of music, a direct connection between the geological and the cultural, between the material and thought. And there's a relation here between upstream and downstream, the anabatic and the katabatic flows, through shifting structural stabilities. And we see this across populations, across landscapes. To quote from the philosopher Michel Serres, "This river, almost stable, although irreversible, this basin, poised on its own imbalance in a precarious state of quasi-equilibrium in its flow toward death, ferries energy and information, knowledge of entropy and negentropy, of order and disorder, both a seresis, rather than a system, and a diaresis. The organism is hence defined from a global perspective. Not actually defined, the word means in effect the opposite of open, but assessed, described, evaluated, and understood. Or within the context of an even more general circulation which goes from the sun to the black depths of space. The organism is a barrier of braided links that leaks like a wicker basket, but can still function as a dam." So perhaps what we can look for is a reimagined concept of the Anabasis, the upstream, and the katabasis, downstream journeys. In Apocalypse Now, we find them stitched together as pure myth and archetype across the geopolitics of the Vietnam War, which is a lens for scrying a different flow of time and identity.
Just keep moving. Lance, keep your hands away from the guns.
We could also look to this anabatic journey as we set the controls for the heart of the sun, to jumpstart it, a somewhat ludicrous concept in Boyle's film Sunshine, but no matter, it is still a magnificent upstream drift into the last moment when gravity and the gravity well at the center of the sun wins in the end. And we're heading straight for Georges Bataille's dream, his nightmare. Someone, was it Negri or Jameson, said that at a certain point Bataille's disregard for the human renders his thought useless to us. But I disagree. Among other obsessions, Bataille was attempting to think a general economy, and that, it is clear to me, is what we need. A truly open model of a general economy for the planetary, the Post Planetary, which will assist us in recognizing our current state as well. And this is, I think, what Peter Watts's work is focusing on, is orbiting around. Here's another quote from Michel Serres. "The living organism, ontogenesis and phylogenesis combined, is of all times. This does not at all mean that it is eternal, but rather that it is an original complex, woven out of all the different times that our intellect subjects to analysis, or that our habits distinguish, or that our spatial environment tolerates. Homeoretic means at least that, the rhesus flows, but similarity pushes upstream and resists. All the temporal vectors possessing a directional arrow are here, in this place, arranged in the shape of a star. What is an organism? A sheaf of times. What is a living system? A bouquet of times. So inevitably, we have moved off planet. This trajectory has taken us off planet. What's at stake out here is survival and cognition, thought itself. And the two are tied together in an unbreakable orbit. As Peter says in The Island, violence, I begin to see, is a planetary phenomenon. Planets are the abusive parents of evolution. Their very surfaces promote warfare, concentrate resources into dense, defensible patches that can be fought over. Gravity forces you to squander energy on vascular systems and skeletal support, stand endless watch against an endless sadistic campaign to squash you flat. Take one wrong step off a perch too high, and all your pricey architecture shatters in an instant. This passage from Watts' story, The Island, is about a mission to build stargates across deep time and the quasi-humans or post-humans who crew the ship, which is engaged in that project, and have an ongoing, very tense dialogue with the partially crippled AI that runs the ship. In another Peter Watts novel, Blindsight, an alien first contact scenario set about 70 years into our future, the crux of the narrative revolves around the human character's attempt to figure out what the alien, which has named itself Rorschach, is. A vast spaceship and an alien entity? And what it wants and what it can do. Is it living? Here's a description. Rorschach's skin was 60% superconducting carbon nanotube. Rorschach's guts were largely hollow. At least some of those hollows appeared to contain an atmosphere. No earthly form of life would have lasted a second in there, though. Intricate topographies of radiation and electromagnetic force seethed around the structure, seethed within it. Charged particles raced around invisible racetracks at relativistic speeds, erupting from jagged openings, hugging curves of magnetic force strong enough for neutron stars, arcing through open space and plunging back into black mass. Occasional protuberances swelled and burst and released clouds of microparticulates, seeding the radiation belts like spores. Rorschach resembled nothing so much as a nest of half-naked cyclotrons tangled one with another. End quote. So, can a tangled nest of cyclotrons be alive? It turns out that this life in Blindsight doesn't even need DNA. One of the human crew observes that the aliens themselves play the role of the honeycomb, drawing from Darwin, and their larger ship takes on the role of the bee, thus inverting the usual phenotype-genotype relationship and shifting the locus of what we usually would recognize as genetic and epigenetic landscapes. Blindsight posits aliens with great computational intelligence, but no ability to recognize self at all. One of the implications in this talk is that various components and substrates of mind are layers in a vast stack, beyond the individual or even the obviously living. Peter Watts deals with this in a very direct way. Every human in Blindsight is already radically post-human, technologically altered and enhanced sometimes beyond recognition. And the aliens are, as well, far outside human concepts of mind and cognition. Indeed, Watts goes to some lengths in his afterword to the novel to unpack what is at stake in the human-to-alien relationship. Central to his argument is the idea that the alien civilization is a kind of flavor of philosophical zombie. They are able to interact with humans, perhaps as a Chinese room. They have astounding computational capacity, but they have no model of self. Indeed, they cannot think themselves at all. Here's what Watts has to say about normal human cognition in the year 2006. Quote, "At least under routine conditions, consciousness does little beyond taking memos from the vastly richer subconscious environment, rubber stamping them and taking the credit for itself. In fact, the non-conscious mind usually works so well on its own that it actually employs a gatekeeper to do nothing but prevent the conscious self from interfering in daily operations. Sentience isn't even necessary to develop a theory of mind. That might seem completely counterintuitive. How could you learn to recognize that other individuals are autonomous agents with their own interests and agendas if you weren't even aware of your own? But there's no contradiction and no call for consciousness. It is entirely possible to track the intentions of others without being the slightest bit self-reflective. And that brings us to the final question, the question of what consciousness costs. Compared to non-conscious processing, self-awareness is slow and expensive. Consider the complex lightning-fast calculations of savants. Those abilities are non-cognitive, and there is evidence that they owe their superfunctionality not to any overarching integration of mental processes, but due to relative neurological fragmentation. Now that's from the afterword, the endnotes to Blindsight. What I'd like to do is focus here in the conclusion of my talk on the question of thought, consciousness, sapience, sentience, or I should say sentience, sapience, thalience, to draw on a concept from a novelist Karl Schroeder, and look at a different range of cosmopolitics that might be constituted by these kinds of self-reflexivities in thought. To what degree should we mourn the loss of our current definition of the human and thought, which Peter underscores for us in the quote I just read? Robin Hanson has dealt with this in one of his texts, The Rapacious Hardscrapple Frontier, in terms of coordination. And I would argue that thought and consciousness and the recursivities therein need to be positioned in the context of coordination. Robin says this: the familiar biological world contains only local coordination. Genes can coordinate within a body and creatures can coordinate within a tribe, but on larger scales, genes, creatures, and tribes compete for scarce resources with little coordination. We humans today coordinate our actions via markets and governments, but even we do not have a strong planetary government. Will our descendants coordinate more than we do? We could say that complex systems, whether biological or non-organic, are part of a flattened ontological continuum. And there's an unavoidable technopolitical question that's directly precipitated by this, the kind of algorithmic imbrications of life itself. Robin Hanson questions this in his Rapacious Hardscrapple Frontier when he talks about the deep time of galactic travel, precisely what Peter deals with in his short story The Island, which I read a quote from earlier. One wonders if our descendants will coordinate. The machinic phylum has been posited by Deleuze and Guattari as a substrate rule set domain, which is not only capable of such future coordination, but is also implicated in all existing coordinations that our laws of physics and cosmology recognize. But let me talk about this range of cosmopolitics: dark, neutral, orthogonal, empathic. Perhaps we can map out a simple spectrum for these cosmopolitics. I'll start with Liu Cixin's trilogy, Three Body, Dark Forest, and Death's End. In a quote from Dark Forest, Cixin unpacks the dark context. There's an implication in his trilogy that in energy-poor systems, which to a greater or lesser degree our entire universe is, a first strike will always be necessary between advanced civilizations. The situation during this passage, which is very lengthy, I won't read this quote, in Dark Forest finds several remaining Earth spaceships fleeing from Earth after an alien attack by the Trausolarians. And these ships simultaneously realize that for a 1,000-year voyage, which they're likely about to begin, or a multi-generation voyage, they'll need to cannibalize parts and resources from each other. And this leads to a first strike. The commanders of these ships all realize, well, we're going to have to wipe out at least one of the other ships and cannibalize from them. And this is bleak for those who do not live, but Cixin Liu frames this particular attack as his main character, Zhang Beihai, does in this episode, in this moment, against the lens of the survival of the species. So the morals and the ethics, when framed against the survival of the species, are much more red in tooth and claw, if you will. And as I said, to what degree should we mourn the loss of our current definition of the human, of the human as a phylogenetic and epigenetic landscape, or our definition of the human as a moral and ethical creature? Quote from Giorgio Agamben here, who then has a quote from Kojève inside of it. Quote, indeed, one of the central issues of Kojève's lectures on Hegel, which Bataille attended at the École des Hautes Études, was the problem of the end of history, and the figure that man and nature would assume in the post-historical world when the patient process of work and negation, by means of which the animal of the species Homo sapiens had become human, reached completion. In one of his characteristic gestures, Kojève dedicates to this problem only a footnote to the 1938-39 course. Kojève says, quote, the disappearance of man at the end of history is not a cosmic catastrophe. The natural world remains what it has been from all eternity. And it is not a biological catastrophe either. Man remains alive as animal in harmony with nature or given being. What disappears is man properly so called. So this in a way is a neutral cosmopolitics because the loss of the human is irrelevant in the broader frame. Another neutral cosmopolitics from Primo Levi in the same vein, quote, "We are alone. If we have interlocutors, they are so far away that barring unforeseeable turns of events, we shall never talk to them. In spite of this, some years ago we sent them a pathetic message. Every year that passes leaves us more alone. Not only are we not the center of the universe, but the universe is not made for human beings. It is hostile, violent, alien. In the sky there are no Elysian fields, only matter and light, distorted, compressed, dilated, and rarefied to a degree that eludes our senses and our language." That sounds very dark, but it's really neutral, right? It's a neutrality in the sense that we'll never reach them and they'll never reach us because the universe is indeed so vast. And so it's neutral. Or there's an orthogonal cosmopolitics, this other version of neutrality. In this one, it's a cosmologically scaled set of shadow biospheres, which Hugo de Garis unpacks, orthogonal life which is outside the constraints of competition. De Garis, who talked about the art-elect war some years ago, reframed his thinking about competition and says, quote, "It should be clear from all this talk of femtotech, attotech, zeptotech, etc., that as one scales down, performance levels increase dramatically." He's talking about computational performance. Quote, "Hence one can readily speculate that any nano-based art-elect sooner or later will not be able to compete with his femto-based cousins and will probably downgrade itself as well. Hence we come inevitably to the following dramatic conclusion. Hyperintelligences that are billions of years older than we are in our universe, which is about 3 times older than our sun, have probably downgraded themselves to achieve hugely greater performance levels. Whole civilizations may be living inside volumes the size of nucleons or smaller." So this is an orthogonal cosmopolitics. There would be no connection between them and us, and we wouldn't need to worry because there would be no competition. Then there's the empathic cosmopolitics, which is unpacked, for example, in the film Arrival, directed by Villeneuve, adapting Ted Chiang's novella, in which a sympathy or an empathy exists between the heptapods and the human, which finds a communication channel, a substrate, in the heptapod language, which allows any mind that operates that language, which I guess one could say is an operating system, it allows any mind that operates that language to perceive time in a different way. And this brings me to the conclusion of this talk, a framework around the question of sapience, sentience, sapience, and thalience. One asks, what are the limits of life and mind? And this image, which you see, which visually represents the actions of neural network software, of course it looks like primitive life, or the outlines of a form of life. One wonders, are the neural pathways indexed here proto-ecologies of mind? What is nature? Maybe borrowing from Foucault and Spinoza, we could say that any given nature can be defined by the ensemble of systems or organisms that it is dangerous to, that it can be affected by. And the collected points of view or cumulative knowledge shared by all agents in a given ensemble allow a definition of what a useful scope of the agency is for that ensemble. A single human is nearly galactic to the viruses that live in us. Perhaps their point of view combined with ours yields a composite nature and a composite temporality as well. Think back to the images of the Mississippi River meanders that I showed a few minutes ago. As Karl Schroeder points out, talking about this idea of thalience, which he uses in his novel Ventus, this idea of connectivity, thalience, could be a way that a general economy of mind, to gene splice George Bataille's general economy, might be achieved. The opinions of systems, of agents in systems, would be equivalent to, or take precedence over, the point of view of a single human or a human culture. Now, it's important to note that this concept is developed and in Karl Schroeder's novel Ventus, in a sci-fi novel set far into the future. But indeed, I think the problem is completely relevant to us, and of course it's relevant to Peter's work in the sense that the model of mind and the model of consciousness that's deployed in Blindsight and echopraxia directly challenges the individual subjective or the culturally coordinated consensus, sentience, sapience model that we currently exist within as humans. This little thought experiment, Schroeder says, asks whether we can turn metaphysics into a hard science. And this becomes the first interesting meaning of the word thalience. That should read word thalience. It is an attempt to give the physical world itself a voice, so that rather than us asking what reality is, reality itself can tell us. And so one of the implications here is that non-organic systems, complex non-organic systems, ranging up to planets, or as Michel Serres points out, stars themselves, may be substrates for a sentience, a sapience, perhaps, and certainly a thalience, as the universe uses its own physical laws to report back to itself its opinions about what it is itself. And so the implication of this, which I have termed massive addressability, borrowing from Michael Whitmore's term massive addressability, and that Carla Leitao and I, my partner, have explored in a number of texts and projects that we've done. The implication of this is that every component of reality, down to the molecular scale and perhaps beyond, could speak in montage to every other component. So this quote from Schroeder, the attempt to give the physical world itself a voice, so that rather than us asking what reality is, reality itself can tell us. The implication of this is there might be an awareness, or even a self-awareness of a planetary system. It, of course, would be inaccessible, utterly inaccessible to the human mind. But when all things have name and voice and speak to each other, this would be a kind of a sapience thalience. Of course, Lem's novel Solaris deals directly with this. Ben Bratton says that we would wish to define the very existence of AI in relation to its ability to mimic how humans think that humans think will be looked back upon as a weird sort of speciesism. And I would extend Ben's beautiful comment on AI to a general model of thought. Natural systems thinking, being aware, either sentient, sapient, or thalient. And of course, the relation between human timescales, planetary systems, information flow, and ecological models all link back to the production of thought itself, whether human thought or non-human, and the possibility of a cosmopolitics emerging from that. It's thinking now, to quote from Borges. The question is, how can the individual think the self to the point where the self nears annihilation yet is not destroyed, but is reinvented? These questions configure our relation with non-human thought, ethics, and ontology. And of course, Peter deals with this all the time in his work, Peter Watts. The concept of the computational gesture as an information-rich but untranslatable act of communication returns ever more powerfully for me here. It does not lead toward many recognizable models of the human. We must adapt, and indeed gesture may be the only true mode of translation we have ever had, the only mode we can have. To paraphrase Gertrude Stein, I like the feeling of gestures doing what they want to do, and as they have to do. My own interest in this lies in the ways we can extrapolate systems behavior to arrive at models of complex life, and also self-aware mind. Cognitive models that are produced as millions of layers of such behavior yield cognition. But I'm also curious to scale the extrapolation back to the way that Ruskin thought of a geological model, mixed with a cultural and architectural modality. So my question there would be twofold. Is there a kind of slow-moving mind produced in that action? Non-human, but really capable of cognition. Sapient? Or thalient? Perhaps across millennia. One of the lingering questions provoked for me by this idea is the challenge it raises in terms of identifying the limits of bodies. In the case of the example I gave earlier from Ruskin, is the architectural style itself the body? Or are the stones themselves of Venice the geologically scaled bodies which we should consider? Or the flickering non-human life and mind of the city of Venice itself over thousands of years? And where would the sounding of this city mind best be taken? Schrödinger says, quote, "A living organism continually increases its entropy, or as you may say, produces positive entropy, and thus tends to approach the dangerous state of maximum entropy, which is of death. It can only keep aloof from it, that is alive, by continually drawing from its environment negative entropy, which is something very positive, as we shall see. What an organism feeds upon is negative entropy." Or to put it less paradoxically, the essential thing in metabolism is that the organism succeeds in freeing itself from all the entropy it cannot help producing while alive. And so I would tie this final meditation back to the questions of thought, sentience, sapience, and thalience. Clearly, Peter's work in Blindsight and Echopraxia deals with this and asks the question, is thought energetically useful? And of course, posits one potential answer, which is that self-recursive computational capacity, thinking about thinking, is not. So I'll leave you with that final question, meditation. The essential thing from Schrödinger, this quote again, "The essential thing in metabolism is that the organism succeeds in freeing itself from all the entropy it cannot help producing while alive." End quote. And so in that context, what we have to ask is what kind of cosmopolitics is produced as one makes the leap from the temporalities of planetary systems, as Peter says, of course, those abusive parents of evolution, out to the black depths of space, as Michel Serres says, back to the sun, the thermal howl of life and language, to quote from Michel Serres. What kind of cosmopolitics is produced? Do we see a dark cosmopolitics, a neutral cosmopolitics, an empathic cosmopolitics? And what is the role of thought and recursivity on every scale across that cosmopolitics? So for me, this is the key question that Peter's work takes on in a beautiful, provocative, challenging way, and that the work of some of the other authors and filmmakers that I've cited during this talk also take on. Thanks very much.